Do you think it would still be just as likely that China would have ignored that ruling?
Yes.
You do?
Yes.
So you don't buy what I kind of hoped earlier you were buying, which was that the United States has some influence over the norm regarding compliance with international law.
It does have some influence. There's no question about it. But the point is that let's assume that in unipolarity, the United States behaved just as you described. Mm-hmm. We paid great attention to not violating international law or international rules. Let's assume that's the case. Then we transition from unipolarity to multipolarity, and the United States and the Chinese are involved in this security competition, mainly in East Asia. I think in that kind of situation, if either side thinks that international law is getting in the way of them doing something that protects a vital interest, they'll violate international law like that.
So the other part of my argument against your position has to do with the idea that as time goes on, it is going to become more and more disadvantageous to the United States for great powers to selectively ignore international law, and that there are two reasons for this, and that if you accept this, let me just give you the two reasons. So the first one is, it seems pretty clear that the United States' relative power in the world is bound to decline. And that's certainly in economic terms. That seems to be happening so far. If you look at American GDP as a percentage of world GDP, on balance, I mean, it kind of goes up and down, but on balance, there seems to be decline, and for intelligible reasons, which is namely, we have a very productive economic system, and more countries have emulated it, even if China is emulating it with significant revision in keeping with the Chinese model. But still, the basic idea of capitalism, leaving aside questions of equity and socioeconomic justice and so on, it's very productive. It leads to prosperous, powerful nations. And as the model has spread, our relatively economic power has seemed to decline. I would expect that to continue. And in the long run, economic power seems to correlate with military power. So you would expect our relative military power to decline. We are seeing the Chinese military grow more formidable even as we speak. And if that's the case, you would expect that a world in which great powers can violate international law when they want, at the expense of less great powers, which is the world you say has existed and the world you say should exist. But if our relative power is declining, then that principle, great powers violating international law, will be less and less advantageous to us, more and more disadvantageous. So maybe we should use this moment when we are powerful and have such influence over global norms with respect to compliance with international law to establish the norm of strict compliance with international law, so that if someday, God forbid, we're only the fourth most powerful military in the world or whatever, we won't have to worry about somebody invading us or whatever. The idea here is we could strengthen the norm of compliance with international law, possibly in an enduring way. And I've just laid out one reason that would make sense. What do you think of that argument?
I think it's an elegant argument, but I think it's wrong. And let me tell you why. During the unipolar moment, the United States was by far the most powerful state on the planet. Almost everybody agrees that we are now in a multipolar world where the other two great powers in the system are China and Russia. And it's China that's racing to catch up with us in that multipolar world. Now, in Bob's story, as we go from unipolarity to multipolarity, there are greater incentives in multipolarity to cooperate and to obey the rules for the United States, because we're not as powerful as we once were when we were in unipolarity. My counter to that would be that in unipolarity, because we had no rival great power, there was hardly ever a reason for us to have to violate international law. Because you remember, John's argument is that survival is the key to the story. It's when your survival is at stake that you'll violate the law. But your survival is certainly not going to be at stake in unipolarity.
And yet we kept thinking it was, but I digress. Go ahead.
Yes. But as we move to multipolarity and you see this competition heating up between the United States and China, that's going to create a situation where the Chinese and the Americans are going to think their survival is at stake here, there, and everywhere. And the incentives to violate international law will be quite great. And I think, by the way, one place you saw this had to do with the ruling on the Philippines, the waters surrounding the Philippines, and whether the Chinese had a right to do X, Y, and Z. And the International Court ruled against China. And the Chinese just thumbed their nose at the ruling. Mm-hmm. They just didn't care. Right. So you see the Americans and the Chinese now are, I think, going to be more prone to violate international law than was the case during the unipolar moment.
Let me ask you this hypothetical. If, since the end of the Cold War, America, and I know this is a wild thought experiment, but suppose every American president had said, we're just going to make a fetish of compliance with international law. And by the way, the Persian Gulf War was in its own way a promising start in the sense that whatever you think of the war, George Bush, the older George Bush, went through the motions. He went to the Security Council. He got the permission. It was a legal war. He was really talking the talk kind of for a while. Now, on the other hand, when he decided to go kidnap the leader of Panama, he I don't know, had a different view maybe, but still, if in this thought experiment, you imagine every president saying, no, I know it might be tempting to bomb Kosovo, might be tempting to invade Iraq, might be tempting to do regime change in Libya. If in all of these cases, we had just delivered a sermon and we'd complied with all the WTO rulings, which actually we've probably been pretty good about, I would guess. But do you think it would still be just as likely that China would have ignored that ruling?
Yes.
You do?
Yes.
So you don't buy what I kind of hoped earlier you were buying, which was that the United States has some influence over the norm regarding compliance with international law.
It does have some influence. There's no question about it. But the point is that let's assume that in unipolarity, the United States behaved just as you described. Mm-hmm. We paid great attention to not violating international law or international rules. Let's assume that's the case. Then we transition from unipolarity to multipolarity, and the United States and the Chinese are involved in this security competition, mainly in East Asia. I think in that kind of situation, if either side thinks that international law is getting in the way of them doing something that protects a vital interest, they'll violate international law like that.
Maybe, but I do think But you do think that the norms matter. You do think that norms can be strengthened or weakened. The norm of compliance with international law. You think they have at least some effect. You don't think it would be decisive in this particular case. Let me say one more thing though. In my thought experiment, I suppose part of our fetish with international law would be, we would focus our indignation against other nations. Because as you may or may not know, I consider myself a certain version of a realist. I call it a progressive realist, but I certainly share with realists a number of things, such as a reluctance to intervene in the internal affairs of nations, unless they do, something truly egregious, true genocide in the old-fashioned sense of the word, things like that. And I share other tendencies of realists, like a big an emphasis on understanding the perspective of the other players and how their perspective may differ from yours, and they have their perception of their interests. Another tendency of realists is a due regard for the law of unintended consequences. War tends to produce unpredicted bad outcomes and so on. So I share that, and to get back to the first of those, the reluctance to intervene in internal affairs. What if the U.S. rhetoric and indignation and its expressions of approval of other nations' behavior and indignation had really focused on international law? And a good example would be like Hong Kong. I mean, I suppose you could argue that's related to international law, the behavior of China there, that it's a kind of a violation of an agreement with Britain. You could make that case, but let's face it, Hong Kong is part of sovereign Chinese territory by any definition. And so in my imaginary world, we would put less rhetorical emphasis on that, but we would put a lot of emphasis when China disregards a ruling about its boundaries, as in the case you just described with the Philippines. But we didn't do that. I don't even recall an American politician commenting. I'm sure they did. I'm sure the State Department said something about international ruling that China ignored. But the fact is, we're not putting our rhetorical emphasis there. We are putting our rhetorical emphasis in other areas that are not about the cultivation of respect for international law, and ultimately are often just futile. I mean, we can't do anything about Hong Kong. We maybe on the margins, but so in my ideal world, it would be a full-out attempt to cultivate strength of respect for international law. So I would just add that. I know that you're still going to say that even if I add that into the thought experiment, China still says screw you about the islands. But anyway, that's part of my thought experiment.